In a quiet park on a sunny afternoon in Atlanta, a 14-year-old black boy sits on a bench, reading a book and waiting for his mom. But his peaceful moment shatters when a suspicious woman confronts him, accusing him of loitering and calling the police. Tension rises as officers arrive, questioning the boy like a criminal. Just when the situation seems ready to spiral out of control, a sleek black SUV pulls up and out steps the city's mayor, his mother. What happens next leaves the entire park speechless and sparks a conversation the community will never forget. The late afternoon sun cast golden rays over Riverside Park in Atlanta, Georgia, filtering through the swaying branches of old oak trees. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, where parents sat on benches chatting and watching their kids. Joggers passed by in steady rhythms, earbuds in, lost in their workouts. Birds chirped overhead, adding to the idyllic atmosphere. It was the kind of place where peace felt almost sacred until it wasn't. On a weathered wooden bench near the fountain, Darius Bennett sat with a book resting on his lap. 14 years old, tall for his age, and lean from playing basketball, he was the picture of quiet focus. He wore a plain white t-shirt and slightly faded jeans, his shoes scuffed but clean. His eyes, dark and thoughtful, scanned the words on the page, but every so often he'd glance at his phone, checking the time. His mom, Monica Bennett, had promised to pick him up after finishing a late meeting at City Hall. Darius didn't mind the wait. He liked the park, the open space, the sounds of life swirling around him, and the feel of the sun warming his skin. It was one of the few places where he felt truly at ease, where he could think without distractions. But today, something felt different. A tingling sense of unease crept into his chest. He shifted slightly, lifting his eyes from the book. Across the park, a woman sat on a nearby bench. She wasn't watching the children or enjoying the scenery. She was watching him. Margaret Lewis, mid-40s, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes, sat rigidly, clutching her handbag. She wore neatly pressed khakis and a button-up shirt, her hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. Her gaze was fixed on Darius, narrowing slightly each time he shifted or looked up from his book. At first, Darius tried to brush it off. Maybe she was just waiting for someone, or maybe he was overthinking things. But as the minutes ticked by, her stares became harder to ignore. She whispered into her phone at one point, glancing at him between sentences. Darius's hands tightened around the edges of his book. He'd dealt with looks like this before, people clutching their purses tighter when he walked by, crossing the street to avoid him, or staring just a little too long as if expecting him to do something wrong. He hated it, but he'd learned to let it roll off his back. Today, though, was different. Today, he was alone. Margaret finally stood, walking toward him with purposeful strides. Darius sat up straighter, bracing himself. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the park like a knife. "Darius, I'm just waiting for my mom." He kept his tone polite, steady, even as his heart began to race. "Margaret, waiting for your mom?" She crossed her arms, eyes scanning him as though searching for cracks in his story. "Margaret, I've seen you sitting here for a while now. People like you don't just hang out at parks for no reason." Darius's stomach twisted. He knew exactly what she meant by people like you. "Darius, I promise, I'm not doing anything wrong. My mom is on her way to pick me up. She's running a little late." Margaret didn't budge. "Margaret, do you have ID? Proof that you're supposed to be here?" "Darius, no, ma'am. I don't carry ID. I'm only 14. The words barely left his mouth before Margaret pulled out her phone and began dialing. "Margaret, I'm calling the police." Panic flared in Darius's chest. "Darius, wait, what? Why? I didn't do anything." Margaret turned away from him, speaking loudly into her phone. "Margaret, yes, there's a suspicious individual in Riverside Park. Young, black male, about 14 or 15. He's been hanging around and acting strange. I think he might be up to something." Darius froze, his thoughts racing. Should he run? Should he stay? He knew that running would only make things worse. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay rooted to the bench, even as tears burned behind his eyes. People nearby started to notice. A few whispered, others pulled out their phones. No one stepped in. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. 2 police cruisers rolled to a stop near the entrance of the park, red and blue lights flashing. Darius's breath hitched as the officers stepped out. The first officer, Reed, was young, tall, and broad-shouldered. His uniform looked crisp, and his eyes immediately locked onto Darius. "Officer Reed, hands where I can see them." Darius stood, slowly raising his hands. "Darius, I didn't do anything, sir." "Officer Reed will figure that out. Just stay where you are and don't move." The second officer, Sergeant Daniels, older and calmer, approached more cautiously, scanning the scene. Margaret stepped forward, pointing at Darius. "Margaret, that's him. He's been sitting here watching people for almost an hour. I think he's casing the place." "Officer Reed, son, we're going to need you to answer a few questions." Darius's voice shook as he tried to explain. "Darius, I'm waiting for my mom. She's picking me up soon. I haven't done anything wrong." Darius stood frozen, his hand still raised as Officer Reed stepped closer, one hand resting near the holster on his belt. The sharp bark of commands and the flashing red and blue lights made his heart pound in his chest. Around him, the gathering crowd murmured in hushed tones, their eyes flicking between Darius and the officers. Some whispered anxiously, while others raised their phones, recording the unfolding scene. Margaret stood a few feet away, arms crossed and lips pressed into a tight line. Her phone was still clutched in her hand, her expression oscillating between righteous indignation and nervous satisfaction. She'd done her part, or so she believed. "Step away from the bench, son," Officer Reed said, his voice firm but not outright hostile. Darius swallowed hard and complied, taking slow, deliberate steps away from the bench and holding his hands out in front of him to show he had nothing to hide. I told you," Darius began, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm just waiting for my mom. She'll be here any minute." "We'll sort that out in a moment," Reed interrupted, taking out a small notepad. "First, we need some identification. You got any ID on you?" "No, sir," Darius replied. "I'm only 14. I don't carry ID." Reed exchanged a look with Sergeant Daniels, who had been quietly observing from a few steps back. Daniels, older and clearly more seasoned, narrowed his eyes but said nothing for the moment. Margaret took a step closer, her heels clicking against the pavement. "He was watching people," she interjected. "I saw him sitting here for over an hour. He wouldn't move even when I asked him to. He's just loitering, maybe even scouting the area." Her words landed heavily, and Darius felt his chest tighten. He looked at Margaret, disbelief etched across his face. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, more to her than to the officers. "I was just sitting there reading my book." "Reading your book?" Margaret scoffed. "Don't try to act innocent." Officer Reed's posture stiffened. "Mom, we'll handle this," he said, though his voice lacked the authority to fully rein in the situation. He turned back to Darius. "You said your mom is coming to pick you up?" "Yes, sir. She'll be here soon." Reed opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Sergeant Daniels stepped forward and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let's not jump to conclusions," Daniels said evenly. He turned his sharp gaze to Margaret. "Ma'am, did you actually see this young man doing anything suspicious? Or are you just assuming based on how long he's been here?" Margaret faltered, her mouth opening and closing as though searching for the right words. "He was just sitting there," she admitted, "but I know the type. He didn't belong." Daniels raised an eyebrow. "Didn't belong," he echoed, his voice calm but layered with subtle challenge. "This is a public park." Margaret flushed, but before she could respond, the sound of a car pulling up nearby interrupted the exchange. Heads turned as a sleek black SUV rolled to a stop near the edge of the park. The rear door opened, and out stepped Monica Bennett Sharp, poised and radiating authority in her tailored suit. The murmur of the crowd grew louder as recognition rippled through the onlookers. "Isn't that the mayor?" someone whispered. Margaret's face drained of color. Monica Bennett's heels clicked against the pavement as she strode toward the scene. Her gaze locked onto her son, her expression a mixture of relief and simmering anger. "Darius," she called, her voice firm. "Mom," Darius nearly choked out, his hands still raised. Monica's eyes shifted immediately to the officers, then to Margaret, who suddenly looked very small despite her earlier bravado. "What is going on here?" Monica demanded, her voice low but carrying undeniable weight. Sergeant Daniels immediately straightened, taking a respectful step back. Officer Reed looked visibly nervous, his earlier confidence evaporating. Monica Bennett's heels clicked sharply against the pavement as she led Darius toward the officers. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the entire park held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Darius walked beside his mother, his shoulders still tense, but the warmth of her protective hand on his back gave him some comfort. He had never been more relieved to see her. Yet, the humiliation lingered, tightening his chest with every step. Sergeant Daniels, sensing the gravity of the moment, gestured toward a quieter spot near the park's edge, away from the growing crowd. The officers Monica, Darius, and Margaret gathered there, leaving the murmuring bystanders to speculate. Margaret followed reluctantly, her arms crossed and her face pale. She clutched her phone, as if it could shield her from the consequences of what was about to unfold. Monica didn't wait for anyone to speak. Her voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. "I want answers," she demanded, fixing her sharp gaze on Sergeant Daniels. "I want to know exactly what happened here, and why my child was treated like a criminal." Daniels cleared his throat. Despite his years of experience, the authority in Monica's voice unsettled him. "We received a call about a suspicious individual," he began carefully, glancing at Margaret. "We responded as we are trained to do, following procedure." "Procedure?" Monica's eyebrows shot up. "Does your procedure involve intimidating and questioning a 14-year-old child without evidence of wrongdoing? Does it involve treating him as a suspect before gathering facts?" Reed shifted uncomfortably beside Daniels but remained silent. "Ma'am," Daniels replied, his voice more measured, "I can assure you there was no intent to mistreat anyone. Given the call we received, we had to act quickly to assess the situation." "Assess the situation?" Monica's tone sharpened. "You had a frightened child and a woman making unfounded accusations. What exactly were you assessing, officer?" "His skin color, his posture on a bench." Margaret flinched at Monica's words, her earlier self-assurance completely shattered. I didn't mean," Margaret stammered. "Didn't mean what?" Monica rounded on her now. "Didn't mean to assume my son was dangerous because of how he looks. Didn't mean to call the police instead of simply asking him another question. Or maybe you didn't mean for this to escalate to the point where my child thought his life might be in danger." Margaret's mouth opened and closed as she tried to form a defense, but none came. Instead, her shoulders slumped and she looked down at the ground. Darius finally spoke, his voice quieter but steady. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," he said, addressing Margaret directly. "I was just sitting there, reading and waiting for my mom. That's all." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes wide with guilt. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just... "You just assumed," Monica finished for her. "And your assumption could have cost my son his dignity or worse." Margaret nodded, her face flushing with shame. "I didn't mean any harm," she repeated, her voice cracking. Monica took a deep breath, visibly working to steady herself. She turned back to Sergeant Daniels. "And what about your officers?" she asked. "Why didn't they investigate properly before escalating this situation? Did they ask him for any explanation? Or did they jump to conclusions too?" Daniels shifted his stance. "I'll be honest with you, Mayor Bennett," he said. "This could have been handled better. I take full responsibility for how it unfolded, and I will be filing a report to review our response and determine what training gaps need to be addressed." Monica's eyes narrowed. "A report is the bare minimum," she said. "I want to see real changes. I want every officer in this precinct to undergo anti-bias training, and I expect follow-ups, not just paperwork that sits in a drawer." Daniels nodded. "I'll make sure it happens," he said firmly. Margaret shifted uneasily, her voice breaking the momentary silence. "I'll go," she said quietly. "I've caused enough trouble already." Monica's gaze softened just slightly as she looked at the woman. "No, you won't," she said. "Running away doesn't fix this. I suggest you take a long, hard look at yourself and figure out how to do better. And when we roll out that training program, I expect to see you there too." Margaret swallowed hard and nodded. The crowd, still lingering at a distance, began to disperse, but the weight of what they had witnessed lingered in the air. Darius exhaled slowly, finally allowing himself to relax as Monica placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home," she said gently. But as they turned to leave, Darius paused. "Wait," he said, looking at Margaret. "I hope you really do mean it that you're sorry." Margaret met his gaze and nodded. "I do," she said quietly. "I really do." With that, Darius walked away with his mother, his head held high despite the lingering ache of what had just happened. As they reached the SUV, Monica squeezed his shoulder. "You handled yourself well," she said. "I'm proud of you." Darius managed a small smile, but as he climbed into the car, he couldn't help but wonder how different the outcome might have been if his mom hadn't arrived in time. And as the park faded into the distance, he resolved to make sure no one else would ever have to feel the way he had felt in that moment. The ride home was quieter than Darius expected. He sat in the passenger seat of the sleek black SUV, staring out the window as the familiar streets of Atlanta rolled past. The city buzzed with life, cars honking, people walking dogs, and families laughing in outdoor cafes, but all Darius could hear was the echo of Officer Reed's sharp commands and Margaret's accusatory tone. His mom drove with a steady hand, her knuckles tight against the steering wheel, but her silence carried weight. Darius knew she was holding back for him. She always kept her composure in public, but he had seen the fire in her eyes earlier. He wasn't sure if it scared him or comforted him more. Finally, Monica broke the silence. "Talk to me, Darius." Her voice was calm, but he could hear the underlying concern. "What's going through your head right now?" Darius hesitated. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quieter than he intended. "I mean, I'm okay now. I guess I'm just angry. Embarrassed." Monica glanced at him, her expression softening. "You have every right to feel that way. What happened back there was wrong, and no one should ever make you feel like you don't belong in your own community." Darius shook his head. "But it keeps happening, Mom. Not just to me, to kids like me everywhere. It's like no matter what we do, people see us as threats first." Monica exhaled deeply, pulling the car into their driveway. She put it in park but didn't get out right away. Instead, she turned to face him. "You're right," she said, "and that's exactly why I have to keep fighting to change it. But it's not just my fight, Darius, it's yours too. Today you stood up for yourself. You kept your cool, even when it wasn't fair. That matters." Darius looked down at his hands. It didn't feel like it mattered. "It did," Monica insisted. "And it still does. But this doesn't end here. Tomorrow we're going to make sure this situation isn't swept under the rug. I'll meet with the chief of police and the city council. I want that training program implemented immediately, and I want updates on how it's going." Darius nodded slowly, absorbing her words, but part of him still felt uneasy. "What about Margaret?" he asked. "She said she was sorry. But what if she didn't mean it?" Monica's eyes softened. "People don't change overnight, Darius, but sometimes moments like today force them to reflect. Whether or not she meant it, she has to sit with what she did. And we're going to hold her accountable to make sure she learns from this." Darius nodded, but the ache in his chest lingered. He knew his mom would fight for change. She always did, but he couldn't help wondering how many other kids like him wouldn't have someone powerful to step in when it counted. The next morning, Monica stood in her office at City Hall, flipping through a thick folder of reports and notes. She had already called an emergency meeting with the police chief and several city officials. Darius sat on a couch by the window, pretending to scroll through his phone, but glancing up nervously every few seconds. "Mom?" he finally asked. "Are you nervous?" Monica smiled faintly. "Not nervous, just focused." Before she could say more, a knock sounded at the door, and her assistant poked her head in. "They're ready for you, Mayor Bennett." Monica stood, straightening her blazer. "Let's do this." Darius stayed behind as she walked out, but he couldn't sit still. After a few minutes, he decided to wander down to the conference room where the meeting was taking place. He stood just outside the door, listening. Inside, Monica's voice carried clearly. "I want immediate action," she said firmly. "Not just promises. This incident highlighted cracks in our system that we can no longer ignore." The police chief cleared his throat. "Mayor Bennett, I understand your frustration, but change takes time. Implementing new training programs, especially ones focused on anti-bias education, requires resources and coordination." "Then find them," Monica snapped. "Because time is a luxury we can't afford. How many more kids like my son have to face this kind of humiliation or worse before we act?" There was a beat of silence, and then Sergeant Daniels' voice cut in. "I think the mayor is right." His tone was steady. "We need to move quickly. What happened yesterday wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a symptom of a much larger issue. If we don't address it now, we'll be back here again, facing something even worse." Darius's heart lifted slightly at Daniel's words. He hadn't expected the officer to take their side so strongly. "Thank you, Sergeant Daniels," Monica said. "Now let's talk about next steps." The rest of the conversation was muffled as Darius stepped back from the door. For the first time since the incident, he felt something other than anger or shame. He felt hope. That evening, Monica sat with Darius at the kitchen table, reviewing the notes from the meeting. "So it's really happening?" Darius asked. Monica smiled. "It is. The program starts next month. And Margaret? What about her?" "She'll be there for the training," she volunteered. Darius raised an eyebrow. "Volunteered? Or was told to?" Monica laughed softly. "Maybe a little of both. But the important thing is she's taking the first step. And so are we." Darius nodded, leaning back in his chair. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "No," Monica agreed, "but it's a start." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling around them. Darius knew this wouldn't be the last time he faced something like this. But for now, he felt stronger knowing his voice had been heard, and that change, even if slow, was coming. The following week, Riverside Park seemed quieter than usual. Darius stood near the same bench where the incident had unfolded, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He glanced around, half expecting someone to stare or whisper, but instead, he saw smiles and nods from a few familiar faces, people who had witnessed what happened. A woman jogging past slowed down and gave him an encouraging smile. "Stay strong, young man," she said before continuing her run. Darius exhaled slowly. He wasn't sure how to feel about the attention. Part of him appreciated the support, but another part of him wished none of it had ever happened. He wished he could go back to being just another kid sitting in the park, invisible and unbothered. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Turning, he saw Margaret approaching. She wasn't as put together as before. Her hair looked hastily tied back, and her face carried the faint shadows of sleepless nights. She hesitated when she saw him, then took a few more steps forward. "Darius," she began, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Darius straightened, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Lewis." She winced slightly at the formality, but pressed on. "I wanted to see you in person. I know I already apologized, but words aren't enough. I was wrong. About everything." Darius didn't say anything. He wanted to believe her, but he wasn't sure if he could trust her change of heart. Margaret swallowed, looking down at her hands. "I've been attending the anti-bias training your mom set up, and it's been eye-opening. I didn't realize how much I was carrying fear. Assumptions, things I thought were harmless. But they weren't harmless. What I did to you wasn't harmless." She looked up, her eyes shining. "I can't change what happened, but I can try to make sure it doesn't happen again to you or anyone else." Darius studied her for a moment before speaking. "How?" Margaret's hands fidgeted, but she stood firm. "I started volunteering at the youth center near here. They need help with tutoring, and I thought maybe I could do some good there. Your mom also asked me to share my story during the trainings to explain what I did and why it was wrong." Darius nodded slowly. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, but forgiveness wasn't something he could offer immediately. "I'm glad you're trying," he said at last. "But it's going to take time. For me and probably for you too." Margaret gave him a small, grateful smile. "I understand." As she walked away, Darius felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't closure. Not exactly. But it was a step towards something better. Back at City Hall, Monica Bennett stood before a packed room. Community leaders, police officers, and concerned citizens filled every seat. The buzz of quiet conversation died down as Monica stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice strong and steady. "What happened last week at Riverside Park was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper issue that has been ignored for far too long." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But today, we're taking action. The anti-bias training program we've implemented isn't just about the police force, it's about our entire community. We're partnering with schools, businesses, and organizations to ensure that everyone young and old understands how bias works and how to confront it. The crowd broke into quiet applause, but Monica wasn't done. Change isn't easy, she continued. It takes effort, education, and accountability. But it's worth it because no one should feel unsafe in their own neighborhood. And no child should be treated like a threat simply for existing. She glanced at Darius, who sat near the front. My son reminded me of something important that day. Progress doesn't happen when we stay silent. It happens when we speak out, even when it's uncomfortable. Weeks passed, and the anti-bias program began to take shape. Officers attended training sessions where they shared personal stories and discussed how to rebuild trust with the community. Schools introduced lessons on empathy and inclusion, with Darius even joining a panel to talk about his experience. The ripple effect spread. Margaret became a regular volunteer at the youth center, slowly building connections with the same community she once viewed with suspicion. Darius noticed her efforts, and over time, their encounters at the park grew less awkward. "Hi, Mrs. Lewis," he greeted her one afternoon as she handed out art supplies to a group of kids. "Hi, Darius," she replied with a genuine smile. It wasn't friendship, but it was progress. One evening, as Darius and Monica sat on their porch, they watched the sun dip below the horizon. "Do you think it's really going to work?" Darius asked, his voice quiet. "The training, the programs, all of it." Monica nodded. "I think it's a start, and sometimes that's enough to make a difference." Darius leaned back in his chair, finally allowing himself to relax. "You know," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "I thought parks were supposed to be peaceful." Monica laughed softly. "They still can be. And maybe now, because of what happened, they'll be even safer for everyone." Darius didn't respond right away, but when he did, his voice carried more certainty than it had in days. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so."